On the night of January 29, 2012, the streets of Dry Creek, a desolate industrial suburb in Adelaide's north, were quiet. It was a Sunday. The kind of evening where the summer heat lingers on the asphalt, long after the sun goes down. A black Ford sedan turned onto Flame Avenue, a dead-end street lined with chain-link fences and darkened warehouses. Inside the car were two men, a father and his 22-year-old son. The father, behind the wheel, was one of the most feared and recognized faces in the Australian underworld. He was a man who had already cheated death so many times that the press had dubbed him Bulletproof. But on this night, the luck that had shielded him for years was about to run out, not for him but for the person he loved most. As the car idled near the curb, the darkness was shattered by the muzzle flashes of a high-powered weapon. Bullets tore through the metal and glass, shredding the interior of the sedan. In a chaotic storm of noise and violence, the father, Gitsura, hit 4 times in the neck and chest, instinctively floored the accelerator, his body screaming in agony as he sped away from the ambush, desperate to find help. He managed to flag down a police patrol car on a nearby main road, collapsing as he screamed for the officers to help his boy. But when the police looked into the passenger seat, the silence was deafening. Giovanni Focarelli, the loyal son who had followed his father into the treacherous world of outlaw motorcycle gangs, was already gone. The Teflon bikie had survived yet again, but this time, the price of his survival was a debt that could never be repaid. To understand how Vince Focarelli ended up bleeding on the side of Prospect Road, clutching the body of his son, you have to understand the chaotic and violent reshaping of the Australian underworld in the late 2000s. Vince Focarelli was not your traditional old-school biker. He was not a man who sat quietly in the corner of a clubhouse nursing a beer. He was a headline grabber, a charismatic and volatile figure who treated gang life less like a brotherhood and more like a corporate takeover. Born in Italy and moving to Australia at the age of 12, Focarelli brought a different energy to the Adelaide crime scene, flashy, loud, and unapologetically ambitious. In a city traditionally dominated by established groups like the Hells Angels and the Finks, Focarelli was a disruptor. He did not just join gangs, he tried to re-engineer them. His resume read like a tour of the underworld's most violent franchises. He started as a member of the Hells Angels, the oldest and most disciplined of the clubs, but his tenure there was short-lived. The rigid hierarchy of the Angels did not suit a man who wanted to be king, and he was eventually expelled, a move that usually marks the end of a bikie's career, often fatally. But Focarelli was different. Instead of disappearing, he pivoted. He formed his own street crew, the New Boys, a street-level gang that aggressively recruited young, impressionable men, before eventually patching over to the Comancheros, a Sydney-based club looking to expand its footprint into South Australia. This expansion was an act of war. The Comancheros were known for their militaristic style and their ruthless approach to territory, and Focarelli was their battering ram. His appointment, as the president of the South Australian chapter, was a direct challenge to every other gang in the state. Suddenly, the unspoken truces that had kept Adelaide relatively quiet were gone. Gyms, tattoo parlors, and nightclubs became battlegrounds. And at the center of every conflict was Vince Focarelli. Between 2006 and 2012, Focarelli became a walking target. The attempts on his life started as warnings and escalated into full-blown military operations. In the early days of the conflict, a bomb was detonated at a dealership associated with him. A message sent in fire and shrapnel that his presence was no longer tolerated. But Focarelli did not back down. If anything, the violence seemed to embolden him. He walked the streets with a swagger that infuriated his rivals, seemingly daring them to try again. And try they did. The second major attempt came in the form of a drive-by shooting that would have killed a lesser man. Focarelli was ambushed while sitting in his vehicle, a hail of bullets pockmarking the chassis. He escaped with his life, chalking it up to the hazards of the trade. The underworld began to whisper that Focarelli had a guardian angel, or perhaps the devil himself was looking out for him. This perceived invincibility only ramped up the tension. The code of silence usually keeps these wars in the shadows. But Focarelli's war was playing out on the nightly news. The third and fourth attempts were chaotic, messy affairs that spilled into the public domain. One incident involved a high-speed chase through the suburbs, vehicles weaving through traffic as gunmen leaned out of windows, turning quiet residential streets into a combat zone. Another occurred at a supermarket in Munro Para, where Focarelli was confronted by rivals in broad daylight. Shoppers dove for cover, as the mundane act of buying groceries turned into a standoff between warring factions. In that incident, it was not just bullets that were feared, it was the sheer brazenness of the violence. Focarelli survived again, but the circle was tightening. The police were watching, the public was terrified, and his enemies were losing patience. They did not want to scare him anymore, they wanted him erased. By 2011, the bikie wars in Adelaide had reached a fever pitch. The Comancheros under Focarelli were isolated. The Finks and the Hells Angels, usually rivals, found a common cause in their hatred for the upstart president. Focarelli's own leadership style was also causing fractures from within. The loyalty of the streets is rented, not owned. And as the heat from law enforcement intensified, the soldiers on the ground began to wonder if their leader was a liability. The fifth attempt was a prelude to the tragedy that would follow. It was a close-range encounter, a botched hit that left Focarelli rattled, but alive. He began to wear bulletproof vests as casual attire. He varied his routes. He became paranoid, seeing potential assassins in every passing car. Yet, he refused to leave Adelaide. He had built an empire of reputation, and walking away would mean admitting defeat. He was the king of the cross in his own mind, a figure who could stand against the combined might of the state's most violent gangs. Then came that fateful night in January 2012. The ambush at Dry Creek was different from the others. It was not a warning or a sloppy drive-by. It was a coordinated execution. The shooters knew his movements. They knew he would be in that car. When Focarelli pulled into Flame Avenue, he was likely meeting someone he trusted. Or perhaps, he was lured there under the guise of a sit-down to discuss a truce. The specifics of why he was there remain murky, buried under the code of silence that Focarelli, even in his grief, refused to fully break. When the shooting stopped and Focarelli realized he was still breathing, the reality of the situation crashed down on him. He was not the only one in the car. Giovanni, his stepson, whom he had raised and brought into the life, was slumped over, unresponsive. The drive to find the police patrol on Prospect Road must have felt like an eternity. Witnesses described a scene of utter devastation. The feared bikie boss, covered in blood, weeping openly on the side of the road as paramedics tried in vain to save the young man. Giovanni died there on the asphalt, the final casualty of a war his father had started. The aftermath of the shooting was the end of Vince Focarelli as Adelaide knew him. While he recovered in the Royal Adelaide Hospital under heavy police guard, his empire crumbled. The Comancheros, seeing the writing on the wall, distanced themselves. His bulletproof aura was gone, replaced by the image of a grieving father who had lost the only thing that mattered. Police arrested Focarelli shortly after his release from the hospital, not for the shooting, but on drug and firearm charges. The king was now just a prisoner, locked away in a cell for 14 months, left alone with the ghosts of his choices. During his time in prison, the landscape of his life shifted entirely. The Australian government, utilising strict character provisions in the Migration Act, moved to cancel his visa. Despite living in Australia for nearly all his life, Focarelli was technically a foreign national. He faced a new battle: deportation to Italy, a country he barely knew. But something else happened in that cell. Focarelli began to turn away from the persona he had cultivated. He spoke of finding religion, of embracing Islam, and of realizing the futility of the path he had walked. When he was released on parole in 2013, he was a marked man in more ways than one. His enemies still wanted him dead. The sixth attempt on his life was a constant, looming shadow. Police intelligence suggested that a contract was still open, active, and high-paying. But Focarelli did not go back to the clubhouses. He opened a restaurant, La Figue Cucina, in Adelaide's Carrington Street. For a brief surreal period, the man who had been the face of organized crime was now serving pasta and shaking hands with customers, preaching peace and redemption. However, the Australian legal system is relentless. The fight to stay in the country ultimately failed, facing inevitable deportation and the constant threat of assassination. If he stayed, Focarelli left Australia. He did not go to Italy, but to Malaysia. Today, the man who survived 6 assassination attempts lives a life that seems almost unrecognizable from the one he left behind. He has reinvented himself as a motivational speaker and a devout Muslim, telling his story to young men in hopes of steering them away from the glamour of gang life. The story of Vince Focarelli is not a hero's journey. It is a brutal lesson in consequences. He survived the bullets, the bombs, and the betrayals, but he could not outrun the karma of the streets. He lives on, breathing and free. But he does so thousands of miles from the grave of the son, who paid the price for his father's ambition. In the end, the Teflon Bikie discovered that while you can survive the hit, you can never survive the heartbreak.